Brothers, sisters, friends, comrades, people of faith and no faith, salam alaikum and greetings. Tonight's event has been organised by the Islamic Education and Research Academy in partnership with the advocacy group CAGE as part of their Don't Hate Debate campaign. The DHD campaign was launched in response to the Charlie Hebdo shooting, which subsequently led to Muslims finding themselves once again at the centre of a freedom of speech debate. The main objectives of the campaign is to provide a platform for people of all faith and no faith and none, just to have an intelligent discussion without fear about their differences. I'm hoping that the event will be conducted in a civilised manner, with mutual respect being the backbone of the debate here tonight. Some of you may find the views of others quite distasteful or even offensive, but it's important to remember that the aim of this event and the DHD campaign is to discuss these differences in a way which does not lead to hatred or violence. So as a ground rule for both panelists and the audience members, there should be no disruptive behaviour, loud heckling or abusive language. That includes shouting, swearing, name-calling, inciting hatred and violence against any particular group. There is external security present, and they will escort anyone who breaks these rules off the premises. Now, I come from Newcastle, a city steeped in soccer history, and so what I'll do is I'll operate a yellow red card system. So, you know, there's one warning and then you're off. I'm hoping that I won't even have to pull out a yellow card. The structure of this event is modelled from tried and tested television debate shows where members of the audience will have the opportunity to pose questions to the speakers or make comments for the panel to discuss. The discussion should last about 90 minutes, and immediately after, everyone will be requested to move to the lobby area where audience members and the press can speak to the panellists. But let me introduce the panellists, and I'm going to start with Moazzam Begg, who I'm sure is known to most of you. He's a former Guantanamo detainee, director of outreach for CAGE, and he's the author of the bestseller Enemy Combatant, which has been translated into several different languages and has featured in numerous literary festivals. He appears extensively in the media discussing human rights, the war on terror, imprisonment without trial, torture, anti-terror legislation. In fact, he was on Sky News Today and other outlets talking about the plight of the last Londoner held in Guantanamo, Shakarama. Next to Moazzam is Professor Peter Cave, who is a celebrated philosopher, humanist, broadcaster, and best-selling author. He's chair of the Humanist Philosophers Group, patron of the British Humanist Association, fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, an honorary member of Population Matters, and he sits on the Council of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. He lectures for the Open University and New York University in London. He's a prolific author, as I mentioned before, and his book, Humanism, A Beginner's Guide, which the British Humanist Association President Polly Toynbee described as a book of our times, was authored by him. And he's also authored the best-selling Can a Robot Be Human and What's Wrong with Eating People? I don't know if that might be one of the questions in here tonight. But
it depends if you have a good wine to go with it.
Right, okay.
Just live with a nice Chianti.
And to my left is British journalist and blogger, columnist for the Daily Telegraph, Dan Hodges. And he's said to be David Cameron's favourite columnist. I don't know how true that is, or if it's a badge of honour or not.
It certainly is a badge of honour.
It is, right?
It's very deceptive.
Okay. And for the last 20 years, Dan has worked as a parliamentary researcher, a Labour Party official, a GMB union official, and director of communications for Transport for London under the former mayor, Ken Livingstone. To my far right is Hamza Tzortzis, an international public speaker, writer, instructor, researcher. He focuses on Islam, Western philosophy, and Islamic thought. He delivers workshops, seminars, and courses on foundations of Islamic thought, and he's head of education and research at iERA, the Islamic Education and Research Academy. You may have seen him on BBC, Newsnight, The Big Questions, numerous other radio, TV and satellite channels. And that's Hamza Tzortzis. To the far left, and it's not often people will say this about Andre Walker, he's a lobby correspondent for the UK arm of the fiercely conservative Breitbart news network, which I'm told makes Fox News look like a Tupperware party. He studied journalism at Birkbeck College whilst working as a senior parliamentary assistant in the House of Commons, and he's a former policy advisor at the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead. Next to Andre is Abdullah al-Andalusi, an international speaker, thinker, intellectual, and Muslim activist. His work involves explaining and demonstrating by rational argument the intellectual proofs for the Islamic belief system and promoting the Islamic way of life and solutions for contemporary problems. He has also spoken at numerous universities and colleges, and like all our panelists, is well known in media circles, on TV, radio, and in the printed press. He's also engaged in a number of lively debates with atheists, secularists, agnostics, liberals, and Christians on a variety of topics, from theology to political philosophy. And in 2009, he co-founded the public discussion forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative, which promotes open dialogue and critical debate between thinkers, academics, politicians, and public speakers of all backgrounds. So that's who our panelists are. And now I've got some questions that have been submitted by people on registration, but I will also come to the audience to ask you for questions as well. But to kick off the event, the first question has come from Shamoly Begum. If you can put your hand up, and yes, and if you, I think that your question is particularly addressed to Moazzam Begg.
What advice would you give for those who are very active on Facebook regarding current affairs on how to best protect themselves, especially now that the CTS has become legislation?
First of all, it's really important to remember that the counter-terrorism and security bill that has been passed as legislation just this week, a lot of those laws and measures already existed. So you had the case of somebody called Azhar Ahmed, who was convicted for putting a post on Facebook a couple of years ago in which he said something along the lines of British soldiers should burn in hell. So the laws for making such comments and statements on social media already existed. The Counterterrorism and Security Bill will simply make those laws and measures even more profound. It's important to recognize that the debate today is about, or the discussion is about free speech. And essentially, people are putting their ideas, their thoughts, onto social media. And it is their thoughts that are being policed. It is the 1984 police state which we're in, which George Orwell wrote in 1948. And you could never imagine that such a situation would occur in Britain. Britain, which is the land of Shakespeare, you have a law, for example, the 2006 Glorification of Terrorism Act. You could never imagine that such a law would have existed in the United Kingdom, whereby a young girl called Samina Malik gets convicted for writing poetry. You could never imagine that a man called Ahmed Faraz gets convicted for publishing books, some of which were written in the 12th century. You could never imagine that people's very ideas, not threats, not incitements to racial hatred, but actually ideas and thoughts, something that this country has claimed to the rest of the world is an intrinsic right, something that this country boasts to the rest of the world. So you wouldn't imagine that these sorts of things already happen. So the Counter-Terrorism and Security Bill, which is now law, having been passed, will introduce the concept of prevent. And for those of you who don't know, prevent will enter, not before, as they did insidiously from the back route, but directly. It will be a part of the legal process whereby university lecturers, nursery attendants, school teachers, people in the medical profession, where there is a client and a privilege between the client and the person who's representing them, will now be subjected to this measure and make people extremely afraid. And the other thing that will happen, of course, is that we, generally I'd say the Muslim community, but this will de facto affect others, are going to be the guinea pigs. What happens with laws such as this is that because they've been untested, the place they'll be tested as to what is and what isn't legal will be the courts. And the people subjected to it will be those of us who are involved in dissent. And this is where the fear will lie.
If I can bring Andre Walker in, I mean, it's your government, your party that is...
Not my party anymore. I'm now a completely neutral journalist.
Right, okay, well, you've thrown me now. But I thought
you spent so long on Press TV with me being a Tory that she's I
thought you were going to say you joined UKIP. But...
no, a bit too left-wing for me, UKIP.
Yes, right. This legislation, do you think it's an attack on free speech?
I think in general there are attacks on free speech that are going on all the time. I think we've gone completely crazy in terms of our thought police and trying to take away free speech. I mean, I would just answer the question that you posed. What you should do on social media, Facebook, is not advocate terrorism, violence, or extremism. And if you don't do that, my understanding is that you will not have a problem with the police knocking on your door. Some of this legislation has to go. There's no doubt about it. I err on the side of free speech. This is the year that we celebrate the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, a great achievement. But I do think that we should be in favour of free speech. But I think part of the reason that we're sat here today is that there is a degree of civility that we have to bring into things. And I think that, look, I didn't read this book, this poetry that this lady wrote, or the books, but I suspect they weren't Janis and John books, and the poetry probably wasn't about cookery. Ultimately, people have to, in a civil society, have some sense and reason. And I suspect the people that they're taking to court are not your nicest people advocating the nicest things. Well, it's not motherhood and apple pie.
In the interest of fairness, do you want to come back?
Yes, it's important. Just so that you know, in both these cases, the convictions were quashed on appeal. So when it went to the Court of Appeal, they understood that this means that what we're saying...
But I'm simply making the point that poetry is not about cookery, is it?
We're talking about poetry.
Yes, but what is the poetry about?
And Wordsworth.
Is the poetry about terrorism and extremism? Come on, admit it, Moazzam.
So,
come on.
If it was,
look, Look, if you sing Mary Has a Little Lamb on Facebook, you'll be absolutely
the IRA
fine.
had a song called How the IRA Made You Run Like Hell Away, was never banned by the British government. Okay,
Well,
so
well,
I mean,
look,
this is
look,
ridiculous.
look. If you don't post, look, just my own piece of advice. If you don't advocate terrorism, you'll be fine. So
Well, if I can bring Dan Hodges in, I mean, what Andre is advocating is self-censorship.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't put words in Andre's mouth. I mean, I think Andre was suggesting that people don't post things that are extremist or advocating violence or terrorism, and I think that is basically is a good rule of thumb. I mean, a couple of points. I think, firstly, I mean, just to pick up on Moazzam's initial point. I mean, fortunately, we are not living in an Orwellian 1984 police state, because if we were, we wouldn't be having this debate this evening. I do obviously appreciate some of the concerns that you've identified. I hope. I mean, I think you made the point that some of these people were arrested for because they weren't nice people. I hope we're not reaching the stage where we're arresting people because they're not nice. Otherwise, God help us, we'll all be in jail. And similarly, I'm not particularly keen on the idea of people being arrested for poetry. But I think we have to be realistic. We are all aware that there are a number of people, a small but significant number of people out there who are using the internet, both directly to coordinate terrorist attacks and also indirectly to advocate extremism, terrorism. And I am glad we live in a society where extremism of all forms is something that is challenged. We do have laws against sort of racially inflammatory, racially offensive statements. Some of that will and has been used to protect the Muslim community. You're absolutely right, obviously, that members of the Muslim community have fallen foul of these laws. It's equally the case. I mean, I think recently we had a recent case where I think somebody on Twitter threatened to blow up Robin Hood Airport, and he himself was arrested. He wasn't a Muslim, so these are things that people from all communities and backgrounds are subject to. But at the end of the day, I think more broadly, in relation to the sort of the nature of the discussion we're having here, one thing that is absolutely clear and has to be absolutely clear from the outset is we do not have an untrammeled right to say whatever we want, wherever we want, wherever we want. We do, within a civilized society and even in a free society, have restraints on what we can say, and that's absolutely right that we do.
Hamza Tzortzis, is that right, that we should be restricted in what we say?
Maybe restriction is a bit of a harsh word. What I would say is I would agree with Dan Hodges that we have to have civility, we have to have a moral framework. But concerning Andre's statement, Andre's statement, I do apologize, that we do also have to understand about definitions, because Andrew's extremism could be someone else's piece, and my extremism could be Andre's piece. I mean, if some people were to read...
I'm not sure most people would think extremism is peaceful, but
well,
I see where you're going with that.
You know what I'm trying to say. It's not damn that analogy, it's a logical fallacy. Basically, what I would say is, if I were to read some of your works, I consider them extreme. Do I want you not to be on the internet? Of course not. What I want you to do, though, is to be civil and to be honest, like you're being at the moment. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to understand that freedom of speech is not an absolute. We have to understand that freedom of speech doesn't have an ontological foundation. You don't ground it in the divine, for example. It's not revelation that everyone is now free to say whatever they want. We know historically that freedom of speech came about as a result of the oppressive Catholic Church, essentially. I know it's a bit crude European understanding, but generally there was oppression. And therefore, people wanted truth, accountability, and progress. So if you're not civil, if you hate, if you degrade and you have gratuitous insults, you're going against the very objectives of freedom of speech, the very objectives of freedom of speech. Imagine I start this debate by swearing out Andre's mother. God forbid, I would never do such a thing.
I do it myself, don't worry. She's used to it. She's used to it.
I find that morally intoxicating, but the point is...
My mother's Northern Irish, she'd beat the hell out of me if I swore at her.
Okay.
Well, if I can bring in
yes, that's my point.
Abdullah Andalusi, I mean, the internet, Twitter, Facebook, all the social networks, are we blundering around in the dark and trying to find out where the limits are?
I think the most insidious thing is we've all just sleepwalked into accepting the word extremist. This word has no objective meaning. It's basically the modern version of heretic, or the secular version of heretic. And we bandy about to say people are different from what the mainstream. There's nothing descriptive in it. And here's the problem. You say that, for example, extremism must be something that's not peaceful. But then why did the government go to the trouble of defining non-violent extremism? If extremism is something that's not peaceful, then why call it non-violent? Why is there a special category called non-violent extremism too? And this is very worrying. I think I would just like to cite perhaps maybe a liberal philosopher back at everybody here, John Locke, who said, he was asked, what is freedom? What does freedom mean? And I think he was speaking to a guy called Robert Farmer, who was saying, is freedom just, you can do whatever you want? And he said, no, freedom is freedom from arbitrary laws and rules which are vague and subjective. Right? That's what he defined as freedom. So by that very definition, if you now are putting extremism into law as something that can be policed, there is no freedom in this country. And just saying, well, we have the freedom to speech is a misnomer. You might as well say we have the right to speech, just like in North Korea you have the right to speech, and in China you have the right to speech, and they have their own versions of extremism, and we have our versions of extremism based on our particular cultural taboos. So I would say that we have blindly accepted the word extremist, and that should be thrown out from the very get-go as the beginning of tyranny. And the end of the freedom, liberties, and the protections that people need to enjoy by knowing where their rights lie. And with a vague word, we don't know where our rights lie, and it's very typically our rights seem to not lie where the government policy is.
Well, thank you for that. We've got a question from Yusuf Patel. Can you put your hand up? Yes, if the mic's just come in. And this is directed at Andre Walker.
Okay. The context behind this question is an article you wrote last week about the protest.
You don't read me, do you? Christ.
And that's the first time I've been to Breitbart. Actually, that's probably the final time. I think so. The question is, how can you say you promote debate when your reporting of peaceful Muslim engagement is spun to give the impression Muslims are a fifth column?
I don't remember the article. I don't know what you mean, but yeah, go on. Well, there we go. It's interactive.
Oh, shall I read you for a second? I like a second.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, actually, I'm really glad you raised this article, because I think what took place in London was one of the most disgraceful displays I've ever seen in my life. I'm sorry you were probably there. But look, in the week when a bill gets passed that further restricts the rights and bullies Muslim people, a load of you guys decide to march on Downing Street, not about that, but about a bloody cartoon from France, the makers of which had been machine gunned. I actually think it is pretty despicable and distasteful to use the name of Muhammad and claim that he would have taken an interest in this complete non-issue when there is so much suffering, hatred against Muslim people. I think anybody who attended that march should hang their head in shame, because they have done absolutely nothing outside Downing Street on some of the really big issues facing this community. I have no respect for you, sir, for going.
Is there anyone here who attended that march who wants to say?
Can I respond?
Yes, Moazzam.
It was quite a good article. I quite liked it, actually.
Were you at the march?
No, I wasn't at the march, and I have my own views about the marches, but please listen to this. That those of you guys who say that this is just about cartoons and it's just all a little bit of a game, let me just remind you of something. That there was a magazine called Der Stürmer that was written by the Nazis, and they caricatured the Jews in it as worms and as animals and as creatures that were subhuman. After that, shortly, the pogroms began, and after that, the final solution. But let me tell you something in more modern history that I've seen and witnessed with these eyes. And that is this, that when the Americans held us in the Guantanamo and Bagram detention facility, it wasn't in a vacuum that they started calling us all the sorts of names that you're quite probably familiar with in terms of anti-Islamic terminology. They would abuse our religion. They would rip the Quran up in front of us and throw it into the toilet. They would curse the name of the Prophet Muhammad. They would curse Allah, they would curse all sorts of Islamic terminologies, and they would strip us naked and beat us and punch us. In fact, one of us, his hands was tied above the top of the cage, and he was repeatedly punched and kicked and punched until he was killed whilst he was saying Allah. And the reason why they killed him was this, and it's in a autopsy report by the US military, is that they found it amusing that every time this man was kicked, he said Allah, Allah. Now, if you take away the language and all of the anti-Islamic language away from it, it would be despicable enough. But once you introduce the language and the demonization of the Muslims in that, it's a different category altogether. And all of this, by the way, it's got to be understood in the context of the war on terror. That whilst the lands, Muslim lands are being bombed, people are being raped, children are being raped en masse in front of their mothers, as the report recently said, the CIA torture report explained that. If you see the reason why all that's happening in Iraq,
where
it's a backlash.
Where were the 3,000 people outside Downing Street for any of that?
But
there weren't
there were millions of people marching against the wall.
They weren't there. The truth of the matter is, a group of people this week went outside Downing Street in order to look big and clever about a magazine they had never heard of until it got attacked.
No,
it's a complete non-issue.
You've dismissed with that statement. You've dismissed everything that I said. You're not looking at all at the reasons. But if this happened in and of itself, by itself, without a war going on,
you're saying that this protest was all about Guantanamo Bay treatment. What rubbish! What rubbish! About rapes that are taking place. What rubbish! It wasn't about that at all. It was one of the most insincere displays. It was a waste of time.
Obviously, I'm going to bring the panellists in. I want your views on this, Dan, because we've got two quite
polarised views there.
Polarised views.
Well, I mean, firstly, on the issue of the march, I mean, I personally don't think those people who were on the march should hang their heads in shame. I'd like to applaud those people who were on the march. If only we all expressed our views in that peaceful way, and if only the people who had murdered the Charlie Hebdo journalists had expressed their views in such an appropriate and peaceful way. I'm not comfortable, Moazzam, with the conflagration of the journalists at Charlie Hebdo with Nazis. You may have your differences with them, and you may have your differences with what they produced, but they were not Nazis. Just another practical point. I mean, the point that you make about the current situation in the Middle East, that it may not be a fashionable view, but the greatest amount of murder and violence and rape of Muslims and violence being directed at Muslims in the Middle East at the moment is being perpetrated by other Muslims.
That's incorrect. I mean, that's completely incorrect.
Well,
Let me just explain to you. I mean, look. Do you know what a daisy cutter is?
Yes.
Okay. It's a 15,000-pound bomb. Okay. It's called a daisy cutter. It's actually a people cutter, and when it lands, it decimates everything in its area. So when these weapons of mass destruction, which are the closest things in conventional weapons that you have to nuclear weapons that were used in Afghanistan and in Iraq, please don't tell me that the Muslims have that sort of weapon and capability and have killed that huge number as they did. In fact, the truth is here.
But who are dropping the barrel bombs in Syria?
Well, that's a different matter altogether, because that's the Assad regime. That's the Assad regime, and we're criminalizing people who are going to defend and fight against that. So please. What's happening here right now, what I'm trying to explain to you, is that the capability for mass destruction, you know who has it and you know who's been doing it.
I know who's got the capability. I'm just pointing out who is, just a factual point about who is killing Muslims in the Middle East at the moment.
Well, we're just going slightly off the subject now, and I just want to bring in Hamza and then Professor Cave. Hamza, you were...
Yeah, bring it back to the topic. I truly believe there's a nice guy in Andre, right? And listen...
His mother loves him.
It normally takes me a bit longer to upset everyone. So
no, I'm actually not upset. I was upset that you swear at your mother, that's why. But
oh, come on, you can't say that's the only thing you'll be bothered about by the end of this talk.
We really respect our mothers, so... basically, what I like to say is, Andre, I think me and you could have a pint of milk any day, right? Now... I reckon, right? See, when it comes to freedom of speech, especially living in a British society, and I'm very proud to be brought up and have been studied here and have friends here, And I see myself as very British from that perspective. So I'm very happy. And what that has taught me, being brought up in Hackney with multiculturalism, is really having something called intellectual and emotional empathy. Because I think the way you've basically categorically said that they've just wasted their time and these people are like almost foolish, I think that's wrong. I know some of these people. I didn't go to them much. They get involved in community cohesion, in homelessness. They pick up the pieces that this government have actually broken, and they do good work. So just to say they've gone to a march and they're all just like ridiculous, forget about them, is actually lacks empathy. The other thing I'd just like to give you some advice, if possible, in a humble way, is that, you know, if I were to speak to you, I would try and find out as best as possible about you, what your views are, what your values are. So when I couch my language, I do it in a way that penetrates your heart and mind. Now you have to understand the Muslim community. We love Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, upon him be peace, more than we love our own mothers. This is a spiritual dimension. Because loving him is a window to divine mercy. It's a window to divine love. So you have to appreciate that spiritual, loving context. So from that perspective, for you to now to dismiss it as nothing, I think lacks a little bit of empathy.
No, that isn't the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that there are no examples that that certainly I could find of Muhammad seeing insulting Muhammad as a major issue. What he felt was the big issues of the day were the spread of Islam and a general humanist support for the community. And I think that if you are saying in the name of Muhammad we have to stop any criticism of Muhammad, and that is the huge issue and that's important. What you're actually doing is
it's not about criticism.
No, what you're actually doing, what you're actually doing is you are taking your human emotion and claiming that there is some sort of theological basis to it, which is simply not the case. If I would argue incredibly strongly, and I think there's a huge amount of evidence that would say that if Muhammad was here today, he would have taken no interest whatsoever in Charlie Hebdo and would have dealt with some of the much larger issues that are facing this community.
If he was here today, maybe Charlie Hebdo would be Muslim, but that's a different issue.
Now we're going way off track. I'm going to bring in...
It's nothing to do with criticism, because Islam has always promoted intellectual debate and dialogue. Even in medieval Baghdad, we had atheists, Muslims and non-Muslims intellectually having a dialogue. But what we say you shouldn't do is be moral. Don't degrade and defame. I mean, have you seen some...
Well, I'm not going to buy a copy of Charlie Hebdo. I've got no interest in it.
Well, we're going to come on to the cartoons in a minute, but I'm coming over to Professor Peter Cave. I mean, are Muslims fifth columnists?
I don't know.
As Andre's article apparently suggests.
Happily, I haven't read Andre's article. I think this is...
It never used the phrase fifth columnist. No, I stand by the article. I'll hand it out later if anyone's interested. Got a photocopier.
Happily, I don't need to speak much because Andre will for me. I suppose I got rather depressed at one point. Well, at my age, I'm always depressed. But I got particularly depressed when somehow there was an implication here that the horrendous deeds which have been done in Guantanamo Bay somehow should be related to a few cartoons published in Paris. You don't have to actually open the cartoon book to look at them if they're going to offend you. Sadly, in your part, you actually had no options where you were in Guantanamo Bay. I think that's a very serious, big distinction, and we ought not to sort of collide the two and start saying, oh, well, we're on a slippery slope between having a few cartoons about Mohammed into having a Guantanamo Bay. As you might well guess, I'm dead against the American activity in some of these areas, whereas being a humanist, I'm very keen on free speech. The other immediate thought, therefore, is that we are having this discussion here in Britain is something which you almost certainly couldn't be having under Sharia law in certain Islamic states. So we should remember that some reasons why some of us get distressed by what some Muslims say is because they are advocating a society in which we wouldn't be able to discuss different religions, in which if you left Islam, you'll then be killed, and so forth. But having said all that, as one says, Bertrand Russell made a quip which said many people would rather die than think, and they do. I really advocate the idea of thinking, and hence I advocate the idea of expressing ourselves. But going back to the first question, which I was excluded from, sadly, I think we should be very, very careful about incitement of violence. By the way, that wasn't a condemnation of the chairman. I just don't get noticed in my pink jacket.
I apologise for that. But if anybody wants to jump in, don't be shy.
Over the colour of my jacket or over Andre?
But I want to bring in Abdullah Andalusi on this issue now. We've had a lot thrown in here, a little bit heated.
Well, I mean, in response to Professor Cave, it was like saying, well, if we should allow, say, racist magazines with grossly offensive, let's say, racist cartoons, and if blacks, Jews, Asians don't like it, they don't have to buy it. They don't have to look at it.
It's a question of the incitement principle. For example, may I give you one very quick example?
Just racial insult, right? Racial insult is not necessarily an incitement to violence. Likewise, religious insult is not necessarily, you might say, an incitement to violence, but does it create a society conducive to understanding, to tolerance, to reciprocity and compassion? No, it does the precise opposite, which is why we have hate speech laws in this country and in most European countries.
I'd much rather have courtesy and politeness, but I can draw attention. I did check this out on the internet today, and I have examples in Brixton and Dalston and so on, in which, as an atheist, I am frequently offended, because I can walk past churches or synagogues or mosques in which they'll tell me I'll have eternal damnation because I'm a non-believer. I find that pretty offensive. And as you well know, there are many, many posters throughout the world which are actually geared to saying how dreadful we're going to burn in hell because we are non-Muslims. That's pretty offensive, but I don't want to stop those posters. But I just think they're rather silly.
We're not talking about offence, though. We're talking about gratuitous insult. There's a difference, right?
That's insulting to me to say I'm going to have eternal damnation.
No, gratuitous insult versus
might not be that
criticism.
Bad. Who knows?
No. Like, look, intellectually and throughout Islamic civilization history, I mean, people, Jews, Christians, and atheists in medieval Baghdad, criticized God, criticized the Prophet Muhammad, denied he was a prophet, maybe said he was a false prophet. I've got a list of
Well, if you're in Pakistan, you decide to
in the medieval
leave the
times.
Islamic faith, you might get killed.
One second. I'm going to talk about the post-colonial creations of Britain. I'm going to talk about Islamic history. All right?
We can easily go to prior states.
So I'm going to talk about
Pakistan.
history. The Pakistani blasphemy law was borrowed from Britain. You should be happy you're having an influence around the world. Anyway. So there are books published in Arabic in Islamic lands criticizing the Prophet Muhammad, criticizing Islam, and these are not
Indeed,
issues.
500, 600 years ago, there are actually cartoons of Muhammad and drawings of Muhammad which were perfectly acceptable at the time. Now, apparently, you are going to get killed if you display them.
It's not just about drawing cartoons. See, it's not even about gratuitous insult. It's about dehumanization. This is the problem. Let's be academic about this.
I thought they were trying to make Muhammad human by showing he had sexual inclinations.
No, that's beyond the point. The point is that when you study the likes of Vivian Burr, social constructionism, the social norm, see, when we use certain language and imagery via the influential structures of society like the media, the politicians, the philosophers, and they always are repeating a certain narrative, say it's against the Muslims or what it is to be a Muslim or what is to be a Muslim that believes.
One second. Evangelical Christians as well. They also want to send me to eternal damnation.
I haven't made my point.
Well, I think that's quite a good point. You ignore the evangelical Christians.
No, I'll get to that in a minute. But what I'm trying to say is the dehumanization, that is the big problem. So even in Islamic law, for example, we believe, for example, if you reject the truth of Islam, you are eligible for divine alienation, which means the fire. We don't hide behind that. We have intellectual nuanced discussion about this. But within our law and our framework, and we believe this is humbly, these are good values, we refuse. I'm not sending you anywhere. You're going to be Muslim soon, inshallah. So the point I'm trying to say is this. I'm not sending you anywhere because we're not allowed to judge either. What I'm trying to say is this.
Frequently judging.
I'm not. Let me just make my point. My point is that if we...
I thought I should do an Andre on you, so
That's fine. I'm used to it. So if we dehumanize an underclass, that creates a narrative. And narratives create behaviors and inclinations in people, and that can lead to something very negative. We had 3 blessed souls that passed away in America. There were 5,000 people attending the janazah, the funeral, and they were killed by someone who was apparently, in love with Richard Dawkins and co. And there was hardly any media outrage. Now imagine if it was a Muslim that killed 3 Christians in America, what kind of noise there would have been. And this is what we don't want. We want fairness, equality, justice, compassion, not just for Muslims, but for everybody. And this is why we don't want a dehumanization campaign against anybody, whether it's me or you. And finally, that's why I really take my hat off to The Independent. They did a very good, amazing tweet campaign, and they said Muslims' lives matter, and they do. Everyone's life matters.
But just, I mean, you said earlier a key point of this is to try and facilitate understanding. So just,
yeah, of course,
just
sure.
so I'm very clear on that. Do you object to images of the Prophet per se? Is it legitimate for an artist to draw an image of the Prophet who is not seeking to be, whose intention is not to be derogatory in, say, the way you would, I assume you would have thought the Charlie Hebdo images were derogatory? Is it legitimate to draw the Prophet, or is there a blanket prohibition on drawing the Prophet?
My personal moral views?
Yeah.
Oh, my personal moral view is that you shouldn't depict the Prophet Muhammad upon him be peace. But I know we live in a secular space. This is the religious ground I'm walking upon. In a secular space, we have to basically understand that we have these differences. So I have that level of tolerance. Islam teaches me to be tolerant. However, to have gratuitous insult, that's damaging.
There's a second point I'd like to make as well.
Of course, sure.
You said in your initial comment, because I wrote it down, that you said we couldn't, you quoted Locke, and you said about how we couldn't have laws that were arbitrary or subjective. Now, to look at a cartoon and say simply by dint of it being a cartoon, regardless of the intent, you take offence from that, then by definition that is subjective, isn't it? You are forming subjective judgment on that cartoon, aren't you?
No, it's intent. I'll give you an example.
But you're implying intent.
No, I'll give an example. So the US Supreme Court has a stone frieze which they impute to be the Prophet Muhammad, or there was South Park did, not the one that everyone thinks of. There was one before that with this episode where they had Krishna, who they claimed to be Krishna, Jesus, Moses, and Prophet Muhammad, and they put an image of him. And why wasn't Muslims offended by that? Although we define it distasteful, but we're not offended by that because there was no intent.
Why do you find it distasteful?
There was no intent to insult. No, we personally find it distasteful. It doesn't mean that we expect non-Muslims to follow our theology on this. We don't say that. But the issue is
why do you find it? This is a genuine question. Why do you find it distasteful? Because just an image of the Prophet itself.
Well, because we don't believe in idolizing or representing images.
But you don't have to be idolizing by having an image.
But we don't take offence with like non-Muslims doing that per se. It's really what the intent behind it, and the intent wasn't to insult, but we personally just wouldn't do it ourselves.
But this is an important point. So you wouldn't actually take offence at an image at a non-Muslim drawing an image of the Prophet per se.
No, I find it distasteful, but I wouldn't view it as an attack upon the Prophet Muhammad or upon the Muslim community.
If I can just bring Moazzam in on this point.
It has to be understood, as I've said again, in the context of the war on terror. If you go back to before the war on terror, there were abusive images made before. In fact, you quoted that there were images of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that had been done from within the Muslim world, I think from within the Shia tradition and so forth. They didn't fight them for that reason. There were other reasons why the Shias and Sunnis fought. That wasn't it. So the reason you must understand, and that's what I re-emphasize again, it's in the context in the war on terror, because the war on terror is seen in the Muslim world as a war on Islam and not just a war on terror. Yes, and once again, just let me finish. If it was a war on terror, then we would have seen members of the rear iERA and the continuity iERA and the Tamil Tigers who carried out suicide bombings. We'd see them in Guantanamo Bay, but we haven't. We've only seen a certain section of the community of the world sent to places like that because the war on terror is de facto a war on Muslims.
But with respect, the argument that it has to be seen in the context of a war on terror, I've heard that argument somewhere before. That's precisely the argument that was used for your incarceration, the abuse you experienced, and the abuse those with you experienced.
Well, now that we're onto the theme of the cartoons, this Cerie Bullivant has a question directed at, it sounds like pick on Andre today, but Breitbart News was one of the few media organisations that actually reproduced the images from the Charlie Hebdo magazine, and I think your question, Cerie, is focusing on that.
We've all been concerned by the reported rise in anti-Semitism. Do you think there is also a problem with the rising Islamophobia in the UK? And are the two comparable?
Yeah, I mean, I think people get very hung up on whether somebody's being discriminated against for religion or their race. Personally, to me, it doesn't matter too much. I think there are problems of discrimination, and I think those problems do need to be addressed.
Have you been discriminated against?
Sorry?
Have you been discriminated against?
Right then. Well, look. I believe I have strong views. I mean, as an example, people are talking about extremism. I believe that if you want to abolish democracy in this country and run it from an unelected government in Brussels, you are an extremist, right? I accept that the majority of people in this country go along with that, but nonetheless, I'm deeply unhappy about it. But yeah, well, look, my family are Northern Irish Catholics, so clearly we had a lot of problems. We had to leave the province, and my grandmother was in fact raided. God, one of the few people in this room. My grandmother was raided by the anti-terror police in 1983. So yeah, and she was completely innocent. So yeah, there is an issue there, but that's something we've got to work through. I mean, I worked in the European Parliament, or the nest of evil, as I like to think of it. And look, that is a far more racist place. The staff at the European Parliament are Arabs. They are hated by the waiting staff at the European Parliament are Arabs. They are absolutely disdained and treated badly by these so-called right-on liberals at the European Parliament who are from continental Europe. I don't know if you know that the Congolese drivers tend to try and avoid they try to pick up British and Irish people because they're actually treated with respect, those taxi drivers, rather than the rest. But I think we are one of the least racist countries in the world. That does not mean people do not get problems, and that does not mean there's a significant amount of discrimination. But for me, I think people should be treated with fairness and respect. Doesn't bother me whether you hate somebody for their religion or the colour of their skin, because I think the outcome is pretty similar. So we need to fight it wherever it exists.
Hamza?
Well, I think we should bring it back to the kind of issue of freedom of speech, and really, I think we all agree, I think we've agreed, I've gathered it from the tone and from some of our discussions, that freedom of speech is not absolute. So the question is, if it's not absolute, then how do we restrict it? For example, if as a Muslim, and I would never do this, but hypothetically, if as a Muslim I were to draw a caricature of the Queen and that I was shooting the Queen, would that be seen as freedom of speech, or would I be put in prison under the CTS bill?
Private Eye does have cartoons.
I'm asking about myself. Forget Private Eye.
It wouldn't bother me. But then again, Charlie Hebdo had all sorts of things about the Pope and whatever.
No, I'm asking a specific question. The specific question is, if I, as a Muslim who looks apparently a Muslim and says,
I wouldn't run into the office and machine gun them, put it that way. Look, it doesn't
bother
me at all. It doesn't bother me at all.
It doesn't bother you.
I don't care.
I wasn't asking about your moral views. I'm asking about what do you think would happen under the new CTS bill?
Well,
if I were to have a cartoon, I drew a cartoon with my own hand of the Queen.
I understand cartoon drawing. Yep.
Good. Of the Queen, you understand the Queen, of course.
Yeah, I understand the Queen.
And that
Elton John and Her Majesty.
Yep, and that, sorry, it's your pen, I do apologize. And that I actually was shooting the Queen. Would that be seen as incitement to hatred and terror?
Well, I would.
Or would that be seen just as like another cartoon?
Well, look, I would since I do not know whether you'd be prosecuted for that. I sincerely hope you would not, because I think it's, and also I'm pretty certain that sort of thing exists fairly regularly. Look, there was stuff in Charlie Hebdo about all sorts of characters. A cartoon of someone shooting the Queen. I mean, I would be extremely sad if police and prosecutors and courts were wasting time on something like that.
Okay. It's just amazing it's astonishing. Some of us just find it astonishing that a few drawings or cartoons can have this outcome.
Yes.
Because you don't actually have to buy the magazine. You had a very, very small circulation. What has generated a very large circulation is a result of the killings, which was, of course, horrendous. And I've noticed that quite a few people have said over the last few weeks, yes, we really objected to the killings, but I'm not so sure about the but. I think we should just say we really objected to the killings, full stop. You ought not to go around killing people because they do a few drawings, however insulted you may feel.
But don't
look at the drawings. If they were going to incite violence, then that would be a different matter, but there's no reason to think that.
Yeah,
indeed, you could actually see why some cartoons have actually been drawn in the last few years, because, as we know, a small minority of Muslims have indeed blown people up. So it seemed very relevant to draw a cartoon with a bomb inside the turban of Muhammad, because they did it in the name of Muhammad.
But I think that there is a determination by the sort of Tommy Robinson and Anjam Chowdhury faction.
Who's
and
Tommy Robinson?
I would join them together to sort of say to you, you have to either be in support of people who gratuitously offend Muslims, or you kind of want to abolish free speech.
Yes, there are grey areas. There's
Well,
bound
yeah,
to
I
be
mean,
grey areas.
ultimately, I believe I have a right to draw a grossly offensive picture of Mohammed. I have no intention of ever using that right. So I don't think it's an either or. And I didn't like this sort of, suddenly, I mean, there's only 60,000 copies of Charlie Hebdo sold globally.
Not now.
Of which, well, that's quite right. Of which none were produced in English, and to get it in Britain, you had to have it posted to you. So what? Circulation in the UK 20, maybe something like that. And actually, the mind boggles that the phenomenon that was the 7 million sales. Most of us in this room had never heard of Charlie Hebdo until the attack. I've met one person who genuinely had read it.
I didn't want to get back to the cartoons, actually. My point was a separate point, which is about freedom of speech. We believe it's not absolute, and the CTS example and the cartoon example was just an example of the grey area.
Well, let me ask Dan. If Hamza did draw this this picture of the Queen, what do you think would happen?
But it's not a correct analogy, is it? Because the Queen is a living individual. So if you were to draw an image of somebody shooting anybody, if I was to draw an image of somebody shooting you, that there would obviously be an implication that was some form of incitement to violence, and I would hope in those circumstances.
Well, say the Queen Mother.
The Queen Mother.
There's
no incitement to violence.
If you did an image of you shooting the Queen Mother, then obviously that. Frankly, I mean, I don't know why you'd do that, but
I wouldn't. Obviously, by the way, I wouldn't want to do that.
But it was an example. That's not. And we were talking about free. I mean, the real analogy here is. I presume most of the people here may have seen it, you may not. Stephen Fry, the comedian, was on a TV programme, I think it was 2 weeks ago, in Ireland, and was asked what he would say to God were he to meet God. And he was absolutely unstinting. It's the most vicious, I think, one of the most vicious and powerful critiques of Christian God that I've seen, and he was absolutely vicious and vituperative to him, and there was comment was passed about it, some of it critical. There was I never saw at any point any suggestion that if Stephen Fry's life was in danger, that Stephen Fry's life was under threat, that Stephen Fry should face any form of censure. Had Stephen Fry said those things about the Prophet, then I think, frankly, Stephen Fry's life would be in danger, and I think there would have been.
Witness Salman Rushdie some years ago.
Well, exactly. Now that is the analogy. Now, if you're honestly going to look me in the eye now and say to me that and you obviously did see the comments, that if Stephen Fry had made those comments about the Prophet, he would have no reason to fear for his life, fine, but I'm afraid I don't believe you. And that is the difference. And if we come back, and let me just say this, because you made the very, very important point at the start about understanding, I want to invert that. You have to understand, as a Muslim, you all have to understand as Muslims, that there are many of us, to go back to the original point, I do think there is an increase in Islamophobia. There are many of us who passionately will defend your right to pursue your faith and pursue your religion in the way you see fit. But you equally have to extend that courtesy to people who have a different view of religion, including your religion. And you have to do so unequivocally, absolutely and unequivocally.
If I can bring...
Actually, the Islamic intellectual tradition actually is full of examples of convivencia, coexistence, interfaith dialogue, to the point where even in our classical texts, I mean, if you were to read Arabic, you just love it. You'd be like, wow, the Muslims are like amazing. You would see that a scholar would be quoting another scholar who says something negative about the Prophet, upon whom be peace. Then you have the Dahriya, who were known as the atheists of the time.
We don't find that today, do we?
That's a different political situation.
But please answer the question.
Yeah.
Please.
Sure.
Why is it that Stephen Fry can make those comments about a Christian God without fear of violence, and yet he cannot make them about your God without
Actually,
feeling.
I'd like to bring it back again, because I think the message is just not being hammered home enough. That if he was doing it at a time when there was relative peace with the Muslim world, then it would be rejected. People would be refuting him and so forth, but he wouldn't have those threats. Because the majority of the threats, you have to remember, they're not coming from the majority of the Muslim population. They're coming from 0.7% of the entire Muslim population. Now,
okay, well, can I just specifically respond to that point? No, but can I just quickly?
You can respond, but let him finish his point.
Is that according to Europol, which is the European police, which is the law enforcement agency for Europe, 0.7% of acts of terrorism, which includes Charlie Hebdo, were carried out by Muslims in Europe. That means 99.3% of terrorism and acts of violence in the name of whatever ideology, including religion, were carried out by non-Muslim actors in Europe. Nobody's talking about that. So we're saying as if by default it's Muslims. Muslims must apologize for everything. We've been apologizing until our backs are broken.
I mean, I've talked about the threat of far-right terrorism. I've written about the threat of far-right terrorism. But I'm sorry. But let me come.
99.7%.
Yes, but
perspective,
please.
But
we're not having a general.
Okay, briefly, Dan, you wanted to come back.
You are again trying to contextualise it in the war on terror. When Salman Rushdie wrote the Satanic Verses, that was well before what we would now characterise as the war on terror.
Indeed.
His life was in danger. Why was his life in danger?
Salman Rushdie's point was the Ayatollah at that time, if you remember, the Ayatollah of Iran had made a fatwa against him.
Yeah, isn't the Ayatollah Muslim?
The Ayatollah wasn't, but it wasn't. He didn't speak for the majority of the Muslims.
He was the only Muslim leader, I think, who issued that fatwa. If I can just bring,
many seemed to support him at the time.
If I can just bring Abdullah in on this.
I think there's a very big straw man. If you think that Stephen Fry can't say exactly the same thing about the God of Islam, then you haven't been to one of our debates.
Yes.
That's every other day with us. We've had people say the Prophet Muhammad is a rapist, a'udhu on our own platforms. They've called the Islamic God sadistic and selfish and so on and so forth, a'udhu. They say all these things on our platform, but and it happens regularly in our debates. I mean, the reason why we do these debates is because we're sick and tired of this misconception that people can't engage with us in that manner. Of course they can, but we know the reason why they're doing it is because it's intellectual critique and dissent, and that's totally fine. We engage in debate. There's no problem with that. It's this misconception of Muslim community which I think feeds Islamophobia, that we are somehow tetchy about intellectual criticism. We love intellectual criticism. We wish there was intellectually critical. Unfortunately, what we get is quite the opposite. We get Muslims being demonized as a fifth column, as we're an existential threat to the West, and that's what makes us uncomfortable. And unfortunately, free Muslims in the USA paid for that level of Islamophobia and that level of misconception, and I think that's what we have to deal with.
And just to add to that, in the early centuries of Islam, we had the Dahriya, who were the naturalists, the empiricists, the atheists of the time. We had intellectual dialogue with them. Al-Ghazali wrote many works against them at a time when Europe was actually persecuting atheists.
Why weren't people prepared to have intellectual dialogue with Salman Rushdie? Why was he?
See, that is a totally different question, because the original question is about this country, our country, about freedom of speech.
Let's handle this question. Why was there a problem with Salman Rushdie?
Yeah, but the question assumes that we have a problem. We don't have a problem. You're lacking the background historical knowledge that we don't have an issue with this.
I'm so old, I was there.
When you say we don't have an issue with this, what do you mean?
Dan, I'll give you an example.
We're not Iranians.
We're not Iranians. You're taking...
So Salman Rushdie was solely at risk from Iranians.
No.
He was not at risk from any other Muslim.
But Dan, you're missing
any
the
other
point.
nationality.
They've taken off.
Okay, it's a logical fallacy to take a specific example and just to make generalities, okay?
You took a specific example about the Muslims being killed in the States the other day.
I'll give you more if you want.
No, let's just hold on.
I just wanted to say...
I'm going to give Andre the last word on this, and then I'm going to throw it out to the audience, because I think we know where everyone's coming from. And
look.
Final word, Andre.
You can intellectualise it as much as you want. Dan is absolutely right. It is extremely dangerous to criticise Muhammad in a way that is not dangerous to criticise Jesus. I am neither a Muslim nor a Christian, nor indeed a Jew or anything else. So, but the other thing is, I just think we need to slam Moazzam Begg's point in the bin because it's rubbish. Look, the truth of the matter is, if the war on terror was not going on, you would still find the Charlie Hebdo cartoons grotesque. Right.
Yes,
the issue that you are saying that this has all got to do with the war on terror is nonsense, and I believe you know it's nonsense.
No, it's not nonsense.
Of course it is. Of course it is. Salman Rushdie before. If we end the war on terror tomorrow, you will hand out Charlie Hebdo, will you?
Okay, I'm throwing it open now. If you belong to an organisation, please say. The brother with the woolly hat and beard.
Good evening, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
2 points. One is, do the panelists really accept that the cartoons is not just about drawing the cartoon about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but rather the cartoons of specifically Charlie Hebdo conform to racist stereotypes of Arabs and Islam that is in sync with the constant demonization that Muslims have seen globally over the last 10 years, which has in turn fueled the war, the moral legitimacy in speech marks of the war on terror and the hate crimes that we see in Europe. The same kind of hate speech that we see cause genocides in the heart of Europe for the last 10 centuries of Europe's history. And the second point is directed towards one of the first points that Andre said, is that the legislation that's come through now, that if we say something innocent as Muslims, that we would not ever be seen as a suspect. Now, very recently today, there was an article that came out of a Muslim marketing manager who texted the word blow away in concerning them to try to blow away the competition at work. Now, his home was raided, and
but it was in Canada. It's not in this country.
No, but it's the same sort of.
Well, you
it's the same
can't
sort of
blame the British government for what the Canadians.
No, but it's the same sort of finger-pointing suspicion that we have with the CTS bill. If I say Valentine's is coming up and I celebrate Valentine's, right? If I said to my fiancée and gave her a present, and I said to my friend, she really loved it, and my friend replied, oh, how did she respond? I replied, well, she was blown away. Does that mean my house will be raided? Because that's the sort of like silly situation that we have.
Right, that's a good point. And over here on the aisle, yes.
Assalamu alaikum. When I hear the different views from the panel, it makes me realise really quite how out of touch the Andre, Dan, and the professor are about what's actually happening with the Muslim community. Sir Peter Fahy, the Chief Metropolitan Police Officer of Manchester, who's in charge of Prevent, says the policy that he's been responsible for executing, the police, which has now gone on to nursery teachers, doctors, nurses, school teachers of all kinds. That policy, he said, we've been asked to be thought police. The Metropolitan Police have been asked to be thought police. Why? Because they're supposed to clamp down on extremism, and he's asked the government for a definition, and they've never given him one. So the police have been operating according to their own definition of extremism for the last 2 years. I work in the NHS, and the Prevent guidance that comes to doctors and nurses at the moment is if you see signs of increased religiosity, a man growing a beard, a woman wearing a hijab who wasn't, somebody who converts to Islam like Sister Yvonne, that's a sign of extremism that you need to now report to the local Prevent officer, and that person then gets channeled into a program of de-radicalization. That's the Stalinist world that Muslims live in this country, and that's the most recent bill that's come after about 9 former counter-terrorism bills in this country since the year 2000, all part of anti-terror policy, which broadly speaking is called the war on terror. And now you can perhaps understand why it's seen as a war on Islam. If growing a beard or wearing a hijab or deciding to go to a gathering where men and women sit separately are all labelled as extremism, and that is now it is now mandatory under law for somebody who observes that to report that to somebody else.
Well, let me bring in Dan Hodges first on on this? I mean, do you think that you're out of touch?
Well, no. I'd like to think not. But although I've thought of that on a lot of issues and found I was badly mistaken. But I don't think, in fairness, I'm particularly out of touch on this one. But you've all heard my view, so I'll leave that for others to be the judge. I mean, 2 points I'd like to pick up on. Firstly, which is a very interesting one. I'm surprised we haven't touched on it more actually, which is the racist stereotype. Sorry, I can't even remember who asked the question.
That was up there on racist stereotyping.
Stereotype. Mm-hmm. Issue in relation to Charlie Hebdo. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I think in terms of the generic Charlie Hebdo content and the depiction of Muslims in general in Charlie Hebdo, I think you're right. I think they were not images. I mean, before the attack on Charlie Hebdo, I didn't like Charlie Hebdo and had said so openly in certain contexts. I didn't like the stereotypical images of Muslims. Remember, if you recall, Charlie Hebdo was also guilty of stereotypical images of Jews, though, and one of their cartoonists was arrested for that. But that is a separate issue. We have laws, fortunately, as we come back to it, we have laws which deal with that. Charlie Hebdo's, let's be clear, the journalists of Charlie Hebdo were not killed by people who were campaigning anti-racists. They were killed by terrorists who targeted them specifically because of their images of the Prophet, not because of their broader images. On the second point, the prevent strategy. I mean, I understand your concerns about trying to define people as extremists. I mean, I know a bit about prevent strategy because when I used to work for the Hope Not Hate campaign, we were very keen to ensure that the prevent and the resources of prevent were used also to tackle far right extremism and the growth of far right and BNP extremism and the penetration into communities. But I do think I think it's absolutely right that the government should be involved in trying to wean people, particularly young people, off extremism of all kinds, and that's what I hope Prevent is trying to do. If there are cases of that along the lines that you articulate, obviously that's something some people should have concerns about. Can I ask you? I mean, you have if I may say so. So you have a very fine beard. Have you ever personally been pulled in by the authorities purely because of your beard or anything along those lines?
Yes, I actually carry...
They pulled you because of your beard?
I actually carry a stop and search notice in my pocket, which said when I went to drop a Palestinian gentleman off at Heathrow, pulled over by armed police, pointed out by El Al staff as looking suspicious. When I was waiting for a friend, okay?
Well, I think we're all aware of how El Al operate.
Well, but that was the armed police that pulled me over.
Yeah,
it was
you just said because
so
you've been identified by El Al
as looking suspicious just by standing there with a beard.
Well, just as a point of interest, if anybody has been pulled up for stop and search, can you put your hand up?
GP I know that's been pulled up on stop and search.
Yeah, but did they say it was specifically because of your beard?
Well, no, but you know, I don't think
it
was because of my haircut.
There are esteemed guests here.
But I would just say this, and this is not meant to be an insult. It's not meant to be an attack, but it really is something to provoke thought amongst these three panelists. When advocates of free expression like yourself actually seem to be wantonly turning a blind eye to the fact that what is meant to be anti-terrorism policy is actually under the name of extremism, this vague term, being used to curtail the expression of 2 million people in their religious beliefs and practices in this country. Actually, it says a lot for how much you actually believe in that consistently, or it seems like that to us.
Well, let me bring in Professor Peter Cave at this point. Were you surprised at the amount of hands that went up there?
I'm not sure whether I was surprised or not. I didn't count. But yes, okay, I was surprised. I would like to make the point. I am here because I'm an atheist and a humanist, and I defend free speech. I certainly do not defend the current government and their anti-terrorist laws. So let's sort of separate out some issues. As somebody who defends free speech, I of course recognize that there are going to be limitations on free speech, namely mainly to do with incitement. And so that would be where I was coming from. So I'm appalled to the extent to which it is the case that lots of people are being pulled up for stop and search. I think, though, we should really remember that, as a matter of fact, many scholarly people who believe in Islam actually have some rather horrendous beliefs. Let's not deny that. I don't know if Hamza still has, but I believe that many Muslims really believe that if you are an apostate, if you're leaving your Islamic religion, then you deserve to be killed. That strikes me as appalling. I'd much rather draw a cartoon and laugh at somebody trying to persuade them not to leave
Well, let
Islam
me bring in Hamza
actually
at this
doing
point just to answer
let's ask Hamza,
answer
do you
that
actually
question.
believe that if somebody born into Islam and then leaves it, then they should be open to being killed, as I gather some Muslims do believe?
When was the last time you beat your wife?
Oh,
I mean, come on, you're asking me a question with the assumption that I have...
And this is an example of you trying to find out how you'll get to understand each other. He asked you a perfectly legitimate question.
Yes, that was nothing like a
gratuitously offensive.
Okay, wait 1 minute. I can't make a joke now. He was making jokes. I'm having a joke.
Funny.
I'm going to answer it. I don't think he's married anyway, so don't worry. He told me he wasn't married.
Implies a wife beater. Very funny. Very good.
But I thought you thought he was like the RMT guy. No, it's far worse being in the RMT.
Listen,
far worse.
Okay, ignore my point.
This is all getting quite baffling.
This is
you a very specific
I'm going to give you my
question.
views. I'm going to give you my views. My views are very simple, right? There are no such thing as apostasy laws in Islam.
So you disagree with many other Islamic scholars?
No, you're missing the point. It's about language. The term apostasy
Killing somebody doesn't sound to be much like language.
Killing is murder. Killing is murder and it's wrong. I'm talking about the concept of apostasy. It's a different reality. We don't believe in a thought police. If you change your mind, we don't have like things in your mind and all of a sudden we're going to kill you. That's not the point.
So let's just
let me tell you what I believe.
Professor Cave won't sing a one song, as we say up north.
If it's about me, it's a issue. This is what I believe. I've been spending
No, you can't.
I've
Not
been
at the
spending
moment.
8 years in this country going to apostates' home. I get calls by mothers, fathers, and even by apostates. And they say, Hamza, can you come to our house? Because we have huge issues. As you can imagine, conservative Muslim families. And I sit there, and what do? I bring the families together. And do you know what my advice is? Don't hate them. Use compassion, use love. And the other thing I tell them is this. Articulate a positive case for your tradition, because many Muslims, unfortunately, were not brought up, we're just socialized into Islam, we're not rationalized into Islam, meaning we don't know about our own values and ethics. So my point is very clear. You don't kill anybody. You have articulation, dialogue, and compassion. I've been doing this. The proof's in the pudding. There's someone in this room who was an ex-apostate. I went to his house and I spoke to him. He became Muslim again, for me, which is great news.
Did he only become Muslim again because you were threatening him?
Ah, that's not nice. Come on. Do I look like a... Give me a hug. Give me a hug.
Okay, Yvonne.
Right.
Sorry, man. I'm not a threatening guy.
Hamza here probably has a cold. That's why
the
I'm
other
hugging
thing. Two members of my family are apostates. 2 members of my family, and I've never mentioned this publicly before.
May I bring it back?
Let me make my point.
May I bring it back?
So I've answered the question.
Right,
No, please,
let's
articulation.
With the question.
Yeah, that's my thing.
I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that certain Islamic scholars firmly announce that if you are an apostate, if you leave the Islamic religion, then you should be killed. And I believe this has actually happened in some countries. If I'm wrong over that, please tell me.
Well, can you
But
address
I
that
believe
as
many
well,
scholars
Hamza,
do.
before I come over to Andre?
Oh, yes. Oh, well, how can I address that? Well, firstly, there are my views.
Well, have the reports been misleading then? Have they just lied to me in the press? And in fact, it's never been the case. Right, I do recognise the press frequently lies, especially the Daily Mail. I'm sure no one here reads the Daily Mail. I hope not. But is it the case that you're saying that there are no Islamic scholars who are erudite in Islam who ever say that...
No, I'm not rejecting that point.
No,
I'm not
so you
rejecting that at all.
acknowledge that from the viewpoint of a non-Muslim, we recognise some Muslims, maybe a small minority, are so embedded in their belief in Islam that if you leave Islam, then you should be killed. That strikes me as an appalling belief, and I'd much rather think that Muslims actually displayed cartoons saying you won't like chatting to Muhammad out in death, rather than trying to kill people who leave the faith.
But what I found interesting is that there was first a question about my own personal beliefs and about other beliefs, and I was just trying to find out if there's an agenda behind the question. No, but why did you want to ask me specifically about those issues? That's one.
Well, because I believe you said you're Muslim.
Yeah, it is another subject, but the point here is you know, there are very...
It's a related
our
subject.
tradition is a very nuanced tradition.
It's a related
Well, I
subject.
think that the response was quite clear, Professor. Hamza was very... Now, I've got to bring in Andre before he self-immolates.
I was just going to say, somebody raised the issue of the prevent strategy. I'm incredibly proud to be able to say that I worked in the only borough in the country that did not have a prevent strategy, the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, because when, and actually Asghar Majid, the councillor, who was, not in charge of the prevent strategy because there wasn't one, essentially the government came to us and said that what we were going to do, we were going to receive an amount of money based on the Muslim population within the area. We were going to take Muslim children to one side, we were going to ask them their views, and then we were going to report those views back to the Home Office so they could be put on the extremist list for life with no appeal, and we told them to and that was the end of it. Now I have to say, no disrespect, but Asghar Majid was the only Muslim councillor in this country that didn't dance down to the Home Office to get his cheque. He was the only person that did it. Every other council in the country, even those ones dominated by Muslims, accepted the money, took the coin and screwed their own community. One guy opposed it in the whole country. And incidentally, I was going to say...
Is he here tonight?
He is actually, just over there.
Do you want to stand up, sir, wherever you are? Yes?
Yeah, right. I thought that was quite a good point. So we'll just move on.
I'd like to interject about this, the apostasy question. When we talk about the rights of Muslims, the first question is, yes, but some Muslims have really horrendous views. So is that a prerequisite for our rights? So if we did have a particular views, we wouldn't deserve any rights. Just as a point of information,
how does that follow?
As a point of information,
just
as a point of information. Again, and I also make this criticism to the Muslim community, we've blindly sleepwalked and accepted certainly English terminology, Western English terminology, for the idea of irtidad. Irtidad shouldn't be translated as apostasy, where you just change your mind, right? Like it's just sedition and treason, really, in a political community under a state. It's wrongly translated as apostasy. We don't have to follow English words in our own legal system. But I make one point that was mentioned earlier. They were said that the killings of the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists had nothing to do with foreign policy and the war on terror, yet the killers were trained by an international terrorist network called Al-Qaeda, sent into France and to perpetrate the war.
That's not what I said.
So
Moazzam said they became offensive because the war on terror existed. I merely asked the question, if there was no war on terror, would they not be offensive? And apparently they're still offensive. Therefore, they've got nothing to do with the war on terror.
Well, I'll tell you what, right? I mean, look, right, in 1936, right, a Swiss, right, not German, a Swiss Nazi member was shot by a Jewish student, Wilhelm Gustloff, for distributing the protocols the elders designed in Switzerland. It wasn't Germany, it was Switzerland before the World War II, and he was shot by a Jewish person. The person had grievances about how anti-Semitism in Europe. He had grievances. This was before concentration camps, before that came about. Now, was Wilhelm Gustloff's killing wrong? Yes, but that's not the point. The point is that in a similar situation, we saw there were people that had grievances, a small minority of them, of this community that felt they were besieged, they were demonized, they were portrayed as a threat. A small minority of them took matters into their own hands and committed a crime. So what I'm saying that Muslims, we're not different in this regard. We're just human, unfortunately, and there are criminals amongst us that do bad things. But you have to look at the background context, the context of the grievances, which has created this whole environment in the first place.
If we can come back to the audience. Yes?
Thank you very much. My sort of point of question is in response to what you were saying about Moazzam's point that the war on terror has made what happened with Charlie Hebdo all the more kind of fraught and more violent. The thing is that even though the authors perhaps of Charlie Hebdo may not claim to be perhaps religious or anything like that, they are at the head of a tradition that stretches way back. And one of the issues with that tradition that it's had with Islam has been the Prophet Muhammad. You imagine the Prophet Muhammad came, you could say 700 years after someone who's meant to lead Christians, they say, into the kingdom of God. He's come, he's sort of, in some ways, put a spanner in the works, you could say. And one of the ways that's been done to Muslims to get one over on Muslims is to attack the Prophet Muhammad. From the earliest days, from the 8th century, 7th century, St. John of Damascus, all of these people, they were attacking Prophet Muhammad. And this has always been the way that they've tried to do it. Charlie Hebdo kind of reignited and kind of brought that kind of historical kind of, the legacy of that sort of battle back into the modern world. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a difficult thing for Muslims, and it's why it's so offensive when people, Europeans especially, try and depict or criticize or malign Prophet Muhammad in that same way.
Well, the clock is right against us now. I can't take any more questions, unfortunately. In conclusion, it just remains for me to say thank you to all of our panelists who've all contributed in their own style and way, and to you, the audience, for what has proved to be a very enlightening, informative, and at points an entertaining evening. iERA and Cage could certainly not have staged tonight without your contributions. Thank you and good night.